Well, welcome everybody. I'm Jess McGlynn, and I'd like to welcome you all to the first meeting of our corporate engagement program. We're very excited to be working with such a great group of companies and industry coalitions and consultants over the next 2 years. And today we're going to cover some basic info on the program, provide you with an overview of step 1, the value chain and impact assessment, and tee up our tools work, which will be your first big opportunity to engage with us. Our group is still coalescing and we have a lot to cover today. So this meeting will be more informational and less interactive than normal. Our future meetings are going to be a lot more interactive and hopefully more fun for all of us. So please stay tuned for those. Please put your questions in the Q&A as we go and we'll try to answer them as we go. Next. So just to recap what our program goals are, it's really to get first line feedback from you on SBTN tools and methods that we're developing so that what we end up with in 2022 is cost effective and relatively easy to use. We also want to help you get prepared and take directionally correct action now. So when the methods are complete, you're going to be ready to set your targets. And we want your help to promote the value of what we're doing here in your networks. And finally, we very much want to identify and remove barriers to setting these targets as we go. Next slide. Here's a reminder of the requirements. At minimum, we need feedback on the guidance and on step 1, and we need feedback on that within a year. And we're going to get into that a little bit more on how to do that. Next slide. A lot of you have asked us about how SBTN is structured. SBTN is part of Global Commons Alliance, or GCA. It's a network of organizations aiming to positively transform the world's economic systems and protect the global commons. Other parts of the GCA include the Earth Commission, and this is a team of leading scientists led by Johan Rockström and Joyita Gupta, helping develop the science going into the science-based targets. Then we have the Earth HQ, which partners with lots of media channels to demonstrate to millions of citizens the state of the Earth and why they should care. And finally, we have the Systems Change Lab that's building enabling systems to scale action around the world. Next. SBTN itself is a network of more than 45 organizations aligning around the need to create and mainstream these methods. The same organizations that are part of SBTI are part of us, and I'm sure you'll recognize some other familiar faces in the nature space, like IUCN, UNEP, WCMC, and Capitals Coalition. Having all these groups working together is helping us to make sure that what we're building is aligned with all the stuff you're doing already. I also want to point out our generous funders at the bottom of the slide. And we can't do this work without their funding. I should mention that the plans we're sharing today are contingent on us continuing to receive and increase our funding levels. Next slide. While SBTN is a large coalition, we do have a very small team running the work. This includes our executive director, Aaron Billman, and our technical comms, operational, and corporate leads. The actual technical development is carried out by experts from the various organizations that you saw on the preceding slide. This is led by Chris Weber, who you're going to hear from in a few minutes, and Sam McCrane. And our network council, made up of reps from our lead organizations, guide our work and strategy. Next. So that's just a recap of some basic information. I'm going to hand it over to Chris Weber, who's going to get into the meat of what we're doing today. Chris?
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, we're excited to kick off this group today, and the initial focus that we're going to do is to try to first, as Jess said, kind of get everyone on the same page, make sure that we're all kind of starting from the same mindset. And then second, kind of cover 2 of the key components that we're going to be focused on for the first few months of the engagement program. Notably, step 1 of the science-based targets for nature process, and the kind of tools by which you are going to use to complete step 1, and the tools that we are hopefully going to be further developing to further enable companies to complete step 1. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to start with a quick temperature or pulse check using Menti. I'm sure many, given the pandemic, everybody's broadly familiar with Menti at this point. So if you can go open a browser window, go to menti.com and enter the code you see on the screen there, 2152278, and then just answer the questions as they appear on the screen. Rachel is helpfully putting the questions into the chat. So question 1 is just, have you read the initial guidance? And question 2 is then going to ask you about how well you think you currently understand the impacts and dependencies of your company on a scale of 1 to 5. So we'll give everyone a bit of time to answer the questions. We'll see how they turn out. All right, so it looks like from the answer to the first question, the overwhelming majority of you have read the initial guidance, which is great. Some of the content we're going to present today, it might be a bit of review, but we're going to, again, we want to make sure everyone's kind of starting from the same space. So we're going to go into some depth on the step 1 part of the guidance. And it looks like the pretty well distributed, skewed distribution, as they say in statistics, with a mean of around 3, which is about average. So that's good. A little bit above that. Sizable number of companies seem to have a relatively good understanding of the impacts and dependencies on nature, with a chunk being considerably higher and a long tail of folks maybe just getting started. So that's pretty much what we expected, which is great to see. And let's keep in mind as we're spinning up the engagement program that we're all on a different we're all kind of on some level of a maturity curve going into this. Different companies, of course, have more or less complex business structures and value chains, and may have come to this issue 5-10 years ago, or might just be starting now. So good things to keep in mind. Let's go forward. So many of you noted you have already read the initial guidance, which is great. There's a lot of technical detail in the guidance itself, as well as in the technical annexes behind it. Some of you, I think, were actually reviewers of the guidance, so thanks for those who had spent time to do so. I'm going to just take probably the next 20 minutes or so to talk through what the guidance has to say about step 1 specifically. We'll talk about the 5 steps in a second. And then to motivate what we're going to do as the main matter of business today, talk about the kind of the tools that currently exist and where we hope to go with the tools. Because as just mentioned, one of the key expectations we have for all of you is to at least complete step 1 of the SBTN process by the end of the year. So we want to make sure, A, that everybody understands what that means, and B, that we're all aware of kind of what tools and already exist to help you do that. So if we go forward 1 slide, again, broad review for probably most of you, but some of you may have may need a quick refresher. We proposed in the initial guidance a 5-step process by which companies will set science-based targets for nature. Today, we're really focused on step 1 and to some extent step 2, because step 1 and 2 are really tightly connected. They are kind of the pre-steps that you need to take before you can go about setting the targets. So essentially, at a very highest level, in step 1, what you're going to do is conduct what we call a materiality and value chain assessment. And this helps you kind of get the raw data you're going to need to set baselines and set targets. In step 2, then there's sort of an interpretation and prioritization of that raw data to kind of figure out exactly where to focus, both in terms of the kind of key issues that you might want to focus on, and the spatial and value chain parts of your business that you're going to want to look at. In step 3, there's the kind of initial baseline measurement, which will use a lot of the data generated in steps 1 and 2. And then the actual target setting, whereby you're going to develop a monitoring plan for how you're going to track the key indicators over time, actually set the targets, and then disclose publicly the baseline information and the target information. Step 4, my personal favorite, is where you actually going to go take action to to deliver on positive outcomes for nature and people and climate. We describe in the guidance this hierarchy of actions that we hope all companies will be using as kind of a key tool to think through how to act for nature. It's called the AR3T structure, and it's based on many years of mitigation and conservation hierarchy work, looking at kind of the key actions and the key order in which actions should be taken for companies to help protect and conserve nature. So that's avoid impacts wherever possible, reduce impacts that can't be avoided, restore and regenerate nature for those impacts that can't be reduced. And finally, the key thing that we've kind of added that makes us a little bit different is this final step of transform. And this kind of builds on a lot of the recent science that says that we really need not just kind of small actions at the margins, but we really need kind of a fundamental transformation both at society level and for individual businesses in order to achieve our kind of key nature and climate goals. Step 5, then, of course, is as you go through the target period, which we expect will be like science-based targets for climate, probably on the order of 5 to 10 to 15 year period. You're going to be tracking how you're doing towards the target by monitoring the key measurement indicators and reporting on progress with hopefully some level of verification. And I see there was a question that popped up. Whether we're engaging with the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Absolutely, yes. One of the key things we are trying to ensure is that all of the measurement and monitoring framework that we're proposing and putting forth is as aligned as possible with existing reporting practices, and as well as kind of where we see things going in the future, like through the TNFD. But also keeping in mind the constraint that we are delivering a science-based target. So we need to kind of balance the science basis and some of the existing reporting practices, which are not always entirely scientific, let's say. Let's move to the next slide. So we are focusing on steps 1 and 2 today. Before you start steps 1 and 2, I think one of the key concepts of the initial guidance that is important to mention is this idea of the sphere of control and influence. This is built on many of the key accounting practices in like the GHG protocol, the Natural Capital Protocol, and so on, where we're expecting companies to kind of think about not only your direct operations, so the kind of the sites that your company owns and operates, but also the upstream and downstream value chain associated with both your inputs and your products going upstream and downstream. But then crucially, also because we're talking about nature, we even need to kind of go beyond the value chain and think about kind of what are the areas of nature that are adjacent to and kind of touching your value chain, but not necessarily a part of your value chain because they are hopefully natural areas. And further, again, because we're interested in systems transformation, we want to make sure companies are also thinking at the broadest scale of sort of what are the big picture transformative actions I can take that might be within my value chain or might be kind of far outside my value chain, such as policy advocacy, ensuring that that your lobbying is in line with what you're trying to do inside the business. And our partners at Business for Nature are kind of key ways that we think about doing that. Noting these kind of spheres of control and influence are considerably broader than the value chain. This is really the kind of starting point to thinking. And crucially, in step 1 and 2, we're going to kind of scope down and think first about the value chain itself and try and gather the key data and inputs that we're going to need about the value chain that will help us deliver on the kinds of transformative actions that we need. So if you go to the next slide, this is a kind of a high level summary of, what are we talking about in steps 1 and 2? And steps 1 and 2, and with, again, noting that step 1 is what we can do today, because, and I'll talk about why in just a second. But step 1 and 2 are essentially collectively these pre-steps that are needed to measure and set targets. And at the highest level, what that means is we're going to be determining which of the kind of key environmental issue areas and which value chain components. So, kind of which of your inputs, which of your suppliers, and which of your product lines, and so on. And crucially, where in the world need to be covered by your science-based targets. So, which issues are we going to talk about? Which value chain components, and where in the world are we going to be looking to be covered by the science-based targets? And step 1 and 2 are complementary in this sense, because step 1 is going to be gathering, again, as I've said, all that kind of crucial raw data on your value chain's impacts and dependencies on nature. That's going to input into step 2, where you're going to do some scientific, but also some kind of judgment and normative calls about how to prioritize different issue areas and different parts of the value chain within that raw data that's coming out of step 1. So I'm going to step 1. We talked through in the guidance having 3 key subcomponents, and I'm going to talk through them kind of relatively quickly right now. The first one being kind of a very high-level checkbox exercise called the sector-level materiality assessment. The second being a hotspot assessment, where you're going to use kind of high-level modeling approaches to try and somewhat maybe qualitative approaches to figure out where the hotspots are in your value chain. And the third being kind of a company level refinement, where you might think about why you might include certain issue areas or certain components, even if they didn't come up high in the hotspot assessment. So let's first talk on the next slide about the sector level materiality assessment. As I said, this is kind of just a first very high level checkbox way of thinking about what are the key impacts on nature that I might be having throughout my value chain, and key dependencies on nature that I might have, just based on what sector am I operating in. So this is based on kind of high level qualitative information and research that one of our key partner organizations, the UNEP WCMC, who Katie and Alex are from and who are going to be speaking in just a second, have gathered across sectors to look at, what are the key impacts and dependencies we know are associated with each sector. And we've taken that kind of, which was mostly focused on the direct operations of the company, and extended that also to include some of the upstream information. Crucially, we don't have a very good way to screen downstream value chain yet. We're working on this, but it's really difficult because a lot of the downstream impacts and dependencies, well, I guess it's more impacts, the downstream impacts of a company on nature are going to be very product specific. So it's not easy to kind of get high level results associated with them, but we'll be developing that over time. For now, what we've done is just this very high level check of within each of the kind of key columns, and I should note these key columns are based on the intergovernmental, I always screw up the name of it, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, essentially the largest scale scientific body on nature. They've classified these 5 key drivers of nature loss. And what we're saying here is basically look at these 5 key drivers and figure out, if you're in a certain sector, what are the chances that these 5 key drivers are going to be important for you, either for your direct operations or for your upstream value chain. And the numbers are just showing kind of a qualitative judgment of severity. If we go to the next slide. Once you have that checkbox exercise complete, which should take all of 10 minutes, it's just looking at a table. The next step is going to be where you have to start kind of gathering some information. Now, crucially, if you've already done anything about anything like a Scope 3 GHG assessment, or a product lifecycle assessment, or a natural capital assessment for your business, you're going to have a lot of this information at your fingertips already. And there's a wide variety of approaches that can be used here. We have not specified a specific kind of approach to take here, because we want to allow you to kind of be open about how you go about doing this hotspot assessment. But essentially, you're going to be using some variety of kind of primary data, which would be, looking at your sites and operations themselves, or sourcing information like where are you buying your key inputs from, or secondary data, meaning like models and life cycle data type information, to get a high level understanding of, within those key impact areas, what kinds of and where in your value chain do you think you're probably having the key impacts and dependencies on nature. I'm showing here kind of two key insights, one from the natural capital assessment, who talks about these 3 key kinds of valuation approaches. I don't personally care for calling them valuation, but they're like, it's more like 3 kinds of impact assessment, because the key thing to understand within the hotspot assessment is that we're talking about different types of environmental issues and trying to assess the relative importance of them. This is a very challenging thing to do. So assessing the relative importance across different types of issues, you need to use some sort of kind of relative scoring mechanism, which can be done in 3 key ways. First, qualitative, kind of just saying, based on either stakeholder type information or survey information, which do we think are most important? The second being quantitative. This would use things like life cycle assessment or life cycle impact assessment methods that try to calculate quantitatively in physical units what are the impacts that different types of activities have. And third, monetary valuation, which essentially tries to put a dollar figure on the environmental impacts associated with each type of environmental impact you're having. Just to show an example of the kind of thing that can come out of this, many of you probably have heard of the EP&L, environmental profit and loss methodology. This is from Caring, just one of many different types of approaches to hotspot assessment, where you kind of look at some key environmental issues along the rows within various parts of your supply chain, kind of supply chain tier 0 through 4, going back and seeing where within my value chain am I expecting to have the kind of biggest impacts on these different types of impact areas. If we go to the next slide, after you do that high-level hotspot assessment, there might still be some, and I've noted there, I see a lot of questions coming in. A lot of them are being answered as we go by our technical team, but as in just a few minutes, we'll stop and do a couple questions live probably too. Once you've gone through that hotspot assessment, the final step is this, what do we call the company level refinement. This is essentially, why would I exclude or include an issue area that maybe didn't come up highly, or why would I exclude something that did come up highly in the hotspot, or why would I include something that didn't come up highly in the hotspot assessment? And this can be for a variety of reasons. We show some here. Generally, if this, what we call the sectoral materiality, or the kind of hotspot value, comes up high, we generally expect it to be covered. But maybe it might be true that your business doesn't perfectly match the sector, and because of that, you can exclude something that might be material at the sector level. So the example that we're showing here, like pesticide runoff, typically is material for your sector, but you only use organic inputs that don't have any reliance on pesticides, so you can rule out pesticides altogether. The flip side would then be sort of what isn't material for your sector but is material for your company. And again, an example here, like, the variety, most utilities companies' land use might be a relatively small part of your footprint, but for a utility that uses a lot of biomass input, land use might be much more material for that particular company. So that's the final step in Substack in step 1. If you go to the next slide, we kind of have this visual of what we then expect to come out of step 1, showing the kind of, again, these 5 key environmental drivers that the IPBES has identified as the key drivers of nature loss: land and sea use change, resource exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. And we're kind of coming out of each one of those steps, we're going to have First, that kind of checkbox exercise of, yeah, we think we're probably going to have to include this. Second, the kind of high level estimate of how important this kind of key impact is in different phases of our life cycle, being raw materials to processing to manufacturing to use. And then, again, why might we also include something else or maybe exclude something because our company isn't exactly representative of the hotspot. Crucially, all of this we should also be trying to place in space in the globe, which is showing kind of on this map, because almost all of the impacts that we're talking about within the nature space are what we say, the technical term, spatially explicit, meaning where you have the impact is very important to how kind of crucial that impact is. So while we're gathering all this information, trying to get as much spatially explicit information about the supply chain is super important. If we go to the next slide, we've gotten a lot of key questions about, and this is my last slide before I pass it on. We've gotten a lot of key questions about sort of like, okay, so I get the general process, but like tell me a bit more about how much time am I going to need to do this? What am I going to need to use? And how good of an answer do I need? So we're trying to give some initial guidance here. Funny that I said it that way, initial guidance, but we're going to give you some initial guidance here, and then through the next few months, as I'll cover when I come back on the line, we're going to be digging into some of the details of this a bit more. So first, in terms of the time needed, a lot of this is going to depend on your business as well as on data availability. If you've already done a lot of work like LCAs and natural capital assessments, you're probably not going to, this isn't going to take you very long. Whereas if you're just starting from square one, it might take several months. So we do think that, starting soon to get the data gathering going is probably going to be important. In terms of the resources needed, we're going to talk about available tools in just a second. Again, it's going to depend a little bit on kind of how much data you already have. And how much of the value chain, how complex your value chain is, and how much of it you're trying to cover. We do expect that we're gonna want to have primary data at least for your operations, but secondary data, the sort of modeled approach, is certainly acceptable for a lot of your upstream and downstream impacts. Now, how good is good? We definitely expect that the key impact areas that you at least kind of take a look at should include those 5 key areas I talked about and that the initial guidance highlights. And at a minimum, we expect that at least you should be talking about sort of spatially explicit data for at least for your own operations. And wherever you have spatially explicit sourcing information, like I get this input from this landscape, that's going to be super helpful for kind of getting a better answer and for your prioritization that's going to come later. So just to summarize, what do we expect within 1 year that you completed this process of step 1, and that you complete our survey, which we will be sending not immediately after this, but in the coming weeks, and that you benchmark kind of what you already have for your materiality assessment against the guidance that we've given in the initial guidance. So I will stop there, and I think we had a couple questions that my team was hoping to answer live.
Yeah, Chris, we got a frequently asked question about specific information on materiality across different sectors. And I just wanted to direct everybody to the full materiality matrix we have in our technical annexes. I'm going to put that in the chat box now, but I just wanted to voice that over, that does exist, and it does cover many of the sectors we've been asked about. As well, there is the Encore tool, which we do recommend in the guidance for assessing impacts, which does also cover all of the sectors we've been asked about.
Thank you. Was there anything else that anybody that came up in the Q&A while I was talking that anybody wants to cover before we move on to the toolkit? Okay, well, and I'll assume that we're doing a very good job of answering your questions as they come in the Q&A box. So please do, if you asked a question, be looking in the Q&A box for the text answers. And then I'm going to pass over to WCMC, our partners. Katie and Alex are going to talk a little bit about both what did we have on tools for assessing, for doing step 1 within the initial guidance, and how are we working to advance the state of the toolbox over the next few months. Take it away.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Chris. And great to be joining you all today. Thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to talk a bit about where we are at today in terms of tools that can support implementation of the Science-Based Targets initial guidance. And then my colleague Alex is going to talk about where we're going and how we see this as a key work stream over the next 6 months. Next slide, please. So at the moment, there are a huge range of tools that can be used in this space, but it can be quite confusing to understand which tool can be used for what. So in the initial guidance, we have this figure, which is shown on your screen here, which gives an overview of the tools which are currently in this space that could be used to implement the initial guidance. So they're shown by realm in terms of land, water, and ocean. Those are issue-specific tools, so whether they're focused on climate change or biodiversity, and those which cut across lots of different areas, which might be used to do spatial analysis, supply chain modeling, materiality assessment, or which compile a load of tool databases altogether. So there's a huge range. This was a non-exhaustive review of the tools that are available. There's a huge range in development as well, including all of these are probably adding lots of new functionalities to themselves, and the space is growing. But unfortunately, there is no perfect tool and no perfect one tool to go to implement the Science-Based Targets guidance at the moment. What we do have in addition to this figure is a decision tree, which is part of the technical annexes to support the initial guidance. And that takes users through a number of different questions. For example, have you identified what your impacts and dependencies of your sector and your activities are, and which of those are potentially material? And it guides you to different tools that you can use to assess those questions. It takes you through a number of different questions, looking at impacts and dependencies and data and different things like that, and directs you to tools you can use. And we also have the sector matrix that Chris has just talked about, which can be a tool that you can use in the first stage of this to identify your sectoral impacts and dependencies. So there's a huge range available at the moment, but as I said, there's no perfect tool and no toolkit which you can go to easily to start implementing this guidance. So this is what we're hoping to work on over the next 6 months with SBTN. And I think a good point to hand over to you, Alex, to run through our initial thoughts and the objectives for the next 6 months.
Thanks, Katie. So Katie's just presented some information on where we are with tools now, and I'm going to talk a bit more about the work that we're going to do on tools going forwards over the next few months, as Katie said. So as you can see on this slide, our overall aim by the end of 2022 is for companies to be able to operationalize the Science-Based Targets process. And for this, we need a suite of tools, or a toolkit, that enables companies to operationalize all the steps that are set out in the initial guidance for business that many of you have already read, as we can see through the Mentipoll. So we're currently starting with a research phase running for the next few months, looking at both user needs and the landscape of currently available tools. And once we have these, we'll be looking to produce a mock-up of tool functionalities and data required, and a mapping of this against existing tools to see where the gaps are for which further tool development is needed to meet the overall objective that we've got there up at the top for the end of 2022. So if we can just move to the next slide, please. So in looking to create our design brief for this toolkit, what we've done so far is just held some initial discussions with the Science-Based Target Network's technical team, who have provided a load of thoughts and ideas to feed into this design brief. And I'm going to spend a couple of slides running through the points that have been raised so far. And then we're going to ask for a little bit more input from you actually. So again, via Menti. So as I'm presenting this, please do think about it critically, as we're going to ask you what you think of it and if there's anything you might change or add in a couple of minutes. So first, what are the initial ideas that have been raised? Well, on this slide, there's some key overarching considerations that are relevant to the scope of the toolkit research work. First, defining a tool. So we're taking a broad definition of anything that supports companies in the Science-Based Targets process to start with. So that includes interfaces that facilitate analysis, like data platforms and databases, modeling softwares, metrics, approaches, frameworks, decision trees, among others. As we enter this process, these are all going to be considered tools as we go in. On the audience for the toolkit, the target primary audience for the toolkit that we're looking at is companies seeking to operationalize the science-based targets process. We want something that's applicable to companies, if possible, across all sectors, sizes, and geographic regions. So again, we've got quite a broad requirement there. Also, other secondary audiences may make use of the toolkit, such as investors, industry coalitions, and all the others listed on the screen. But the toolkit won't be designed primarily for these secondary audiences. Through the user needs assessment, we're going to explore similarities and potential differences between the needs of these audiences, but the primary focus when we come to the toolkit is companies seeking to operationalize the guidance. And in this toolkit work, as Katie's already highlighted, there's a plethora of tools out there, and we're not seeking to replace or duplicate these. We're looking to identify those that are currently fit for different steps of the science-based targets process, or perhaps could be fit for the process with a few tweaks, and then develop them accordingly. So I'm not saying development of new tools won't occur. It may, if significant gaps are found that are not well addressed by any of the options currently available. But we're primarily looking to signpost and build on and complement the great existing tools that are already out there. And on resources and data, we want a toolkit that will be suitable for companies with both a large volume of high quality input data and also offer alternative options that are suitable for companies with more limited data, about removing those barriers so lots of companies can engage with this process. And as I said, these ideas are all going to be reviewed based on the findings of our research, but this is our initial brain dump of thoughts. So if we can move on to the next slide. Thanks. We've got a bit more of that. So here over the next 2 slides, we have a load of further points that came out of these discussions with the technical team. And they're arranged along this indicative axis running from absolutely essential features on the right-hand side to on the next slide. So this arrow at the top expands onto the next slide where we would have the features that would also be great to include if we can, but are more on the desirable end of the spectrum. So this slide is the initial thoughts and essential needs. Then the next slide is more the wants or the desirable features. So to run through these quite quickly, starting from the, if we can just go back to the, yeah, brilliant, thanks. On the essential slide, sorry, Aaron, just back 1 slide. Great, thank you. So starting from the top right corner of these points. So as we've already noted, the toolkit needs to meet the needs of the primary audience, cover all steps in the science-based targets process and be comprehensive, and offer options for companies with differing data availability, as I previously noted. So moving left, those companies that already have lots of data obviously need to be able to upload and use it in a secure tool interface and save their outputs with a timestamp. The outputs need to be quick and easy to understand, as we want the toolkit to be broadly applicable to lots of companies with different expertise, and also make it easy for senior decision makers within companies to quickly be able to pick up and interpret the analysis results. And the terminology used within the tool, or any names of indicators or such like, needs to be really specific and precise. As noted, we want to build on existing tools as much as possible. This next one, plurality of approaches, is an important point. So we want to provide lots of different approaches and not be too prescriptive about what you must do, but set out the range of acceptable options, noting that different options will likely be more suitable for different companies depending on their context. And we also want the toolkit to be suitable for non-technical users. So again, we don't want to restrict the users to just those with perhaps coding skills or GIS skills, but we want to make it accessible to a wide range of users. Can we move to the next slide now, please, Erin? Thanks. So think of this as a continuation of the last one with the more desirable but not necessary essential features. So starting from the top right again, a key facet of science-based targets, I suppose, is different actors within the landscape doing enough to achieve what we all need to do as a society to stay within Earth's system limits. So for these actors, we'll need to share their targets and outcomes somewhere, and perhaps the toolkit could provide an avenue for this to see how people are working together to achieve what we need to. We're thinking about a new front end for step 1A, which is the sector level materiality assessment. And we also want to provide guidance on uncertainty as part of this toolkit. So as many of you will be aware, uncertainty is a regular feature of environmental analysis. And we want the toolkit to make clear the implications of this for how companies interpret the results that are obtained. We want automatic data updates. So many of the data sets that underpin these kinds of tools are updated regularly, and we want these updates to feed automatically into the tool backend, so companies always have access to the most up-to-date data. Then on the far left-hand side, the desirable but not essential features. As I've already mentioned, we want to provide for secondary audiences if and where we can, but the main focus is companies, so hence this is right on the desirable end. And then the final point, so as part of this research work, we're also likely to come up with a list of requirements for tools to be suitable for the process. So as a nice side deliverable to this work, something we could do is look to take this list of criteria and publish it as a kind of standard that third-party tool providers can then design to, which should aid improvement in the tools landscape available to companies going forwards. So on the next slide, we're now moving over to questions for you. So this is just last two slides, the last two slides summarized in one place as a reminder. And now, as promised, we have a couple of Menti questions, which start off by getting your thoughts on what I've just been speaking about. So if we go on to the next slide, you should already have the Menti open from before, but maybe we can switch over to showing that on the screen. The code's there. So brilliant. The first question, just a nice, simple, multiple choice one. Do you agree with the initial ideas of the technical team? So essentially what I've just been saying and presenting, is that something that sounds good for you as requirements for a toolkit, or are there aspects that you disagree with? So just give people a couple of minutes to fill that in. Perfect, that's looking good. Lots of responses coming in there. We'll just give it another 20 seconds or so before moving on to the next questions. I can see the numbers still going up at the bottom as people get onto the Menti. That's great, so thanks. So we're looking at broad agreement, but there's also some disagreement with some parts of the specification. Which leads us nicely onto our next question, if we can flip over to that one. So this is an open-ended question, so perhaps a little bit more thinking required from your end, but are there any further key considerations or suggestions that you would add to the Science-Based Targets Toolkit design brief? Or for anyone that clicked that they disagree with some parts of the specification here, this is where you could perhaps write what aspects of it you disagreed with. Let's give people a couple of minutes to type their responses and think about them. No idea. So quite a hard question to think about. We have a couple of minutes on this, so if people want to provide their feedback in that way, or we're also going to dive into this a bit more with interviews and the like later on in the process, so there'll be some opportunity to explore it more there. I should stress that the Menti results are all anonymous, so really if you really disagreed with whatever I said, you can write whatever you want here and it can't be attributed back to you at all. Brilliant, thank you very much. A couple more coming in now. Fantastic, thanks everyone. Okay, this is really great. There's lots coming in here actually, which is brilliant after the initial worrying quiet. So perhaps just have 30 more seconds on this question, as there's still loads of people putting in their thoughts. Well, that's really great. We've got loads of inputs there. So thank you very much to everyone that suggested something. Now, maybe if we can move on to the third question. We've got two more questions. So changing tack slightly, this is thinking back about step 1, assess, which Chris just presented. So we're now asking, which of these steps has your business carried out so far? I think you should be able to select multiple options if you've done several of the steps, or if you've done all of step 1, but just to get a feel for this across the audience, we'll have about maybe a minute and a half to answer this question. just 15 more seconds maybe, as the numbers are starting to go up a bit more slowly.
And Alex, I don't think we have a question about it, but if people want to add in the Q&A about any reasons for why you haven't started, particularly if they're related to tools and there not being a tool available to do it, that would be really useful for us to know. So I think our next question is about what tools did you use, but if there's a reason, tool-related reason why you haven't started yet, we'd be really keen to know what that is.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Katie. Okay, maybe if we now move on to our final question. So relating to the question you've just answered, did you use any tools to support you in this? Maybe tools out of the table in the initial guidance that Katie showed, or maybe other tools that you used, and just any more information about what you did and how you did it, just to take into our initial scoping of where companies are at the moment. This is another open-ended one, so just give it a couple of minutes before people start putting some things in. That's great. Lots of responses coming in. Thanks, everyone. Okay, perhaps just another 30 more seconds on this question. Okay, brilliant. I think we can leave it there. So that's the last question on the toolkit slides for now. So thank you very much, everyone, for your input there. It's really, really appreciated. And we'll go through it all. I'm sure lots of it's very, very useful. And now I'm going to hand back to Chris to talk a bit more about technical development work and opportunities for you to engage further with it. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. And and thanks so much for all of the input there. That was really useful to get to see all the tools you're using. Very happy to hear that some of you are using your brains to do the step one. It's a very useful tool. I agree. We are so yeah. Then the rest of for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about what the schedule for the engagement program for the next few months is going to look like. We've got a lot of questions from many of you about this, so we wanted to provide kind of a high-level overview of what are the kinds of key things we're going to be talking about for the next few months, and when, because I know that some of you have noted that many different people from your organization might be relevant to different types of discussions. So we're gonna start by first kind of talking at the high level, what are the key questions for each of the steps that we're gonna be working on over the next few months and seeking your input on. So if you go to the next slide, just the next 3 slides talk about some of the key questions that our technical development team is going to be working on. I should say that it's not just the central, not even primarily the central SBTN team that's going to be working on this. As we presented at the outset, kind of our technical work is spread across a number of different organizations and organized into kind of a matrix approach of cross-cutting technical stuff, as well as kind of issue-specific technical work that happens within these key issue hubs, as we talk about, being biodiversity, water, land, and ocean. So these are the kind of key cross-cutting questions that we're going to be asking, but it's important to note that there's going to be kind of specific nuance to answer them for each of the key issue areas. And that's one of the key balancing acts that we have to be doing throughout all of this work, because what works for water might not work for land and might not work for biodiversity and so on. So it's definitely a fun challenge to try to figure out how standardized we can make all of these things across the pretty large scope that we're trying to cover in SBTN. So what are some of these key questions cross-cutting that within step one we're trying to answer? Some of them should be pretty obvious based on the presentation I already did. We're kind of trying to figure out where should we make specific issue areas mandatory for different industries or sub-industries. Like right now it's just guidance, but over time, once we're actually starting to take and validate targets from companies, we're going to have to know kind of what are the rules of the road for who has to set which targets. Everything we just talked about tools, how can companies get a quick and dirty understanding of their impacts, dependencies, restoration potential, et cetera. And crucially, kind of what kinds of data are you going to need to do this, be it primary data, secondary data, spend data, location data, and so on. One of the things we're really thinking about too is how does this vary for kind of your scope 1, if you will, of the direct operations versus your scope 3 and your kind of key inputs, and how does that vary within the inputs, whether you know the sourcing spatially or not. We want to have a series of tools that are going to be applicable to both direct operations, where you kind of know exactly where you're operating, as well as cases of sourced information, spatial sourcing information, and sourcing information where you might not have a spatial breakdown. And again, this is one of the challenges we're trying to figure out as we think through the different issues and for different types of companies. Definitely, we're going to have to think about what types of exclusions can be justified for that step 1C that we talked about, and kind of further guidance on that step of what reasons might a company need need to kind of take a target into account. We've heard from several companies that further guidance is needed on that particular question. Next slide. Within step 2, and we haven't talked a lot about step 2 yet, but recall step 2 is basically taking the raw data from the materiality assessment and then trying to figure out kind of where and which issue areas and what parts of the value chain are going to be included within the target. So the most obvious key question here is what proportion of the estimated impact of your value chain must be covered by the targets. The way that the SBTI has done this for climate has been a relatively simplistic approach. Based on a certain share of your total value chain emissions must be covered. That may or may not be appropriate for nature issues, and we're going to be thinking that through. Similarly, if you're not covering a certain part of your value chain, can kind of taking certain actions in one part of your value chain compensate for not taking action elsewhere, or for time lags in action elsewhere? Complicated normative question there. If, as we're assuming that the minimum coverage of a target is less than 100% of your total kind of estimated impact, this is what step 2 is all about. How do you go about choosing which parts of the value chain to include and which parts can be excluded? And crucially, how much guidance should SBTN give versus should we kind of allow that to be fully up to the company? And finally, again, kind of since we're dealing with all of these different issues, should the criteria by which companies think about whether to include or exclude a certain site or a certain part of your value chain be similar for water and biodiversity and pollution and land? It's very likely that the prioritization criteria might look pretty different for those different issue areas. And then we haven't talked a lot about step 3, the actual measurement, on the next slide. But obviously, we're working through all of this at a issue area specific function right now. sort of what actually is the indicators and measurement frameworks that we're going to be using. Which standard methods and tools exist to help a company calculate those key indicators, and how does, again, that vary for say a scope 1 type impact versus a scope 3 type impact when you know your sourcing or don't know your sourcing. What are we going to, another key issue that we're going to be thinking through is this idea of reference levels for each issue area. This is having to do with the state of nature in different places. How are we trying to kind of benchmark the level, the state of nature where it is now and where it should be relative to either historical baseline or the current baseline and so on. Crucially, obviously, we are at the Science-Based Targets Network, so trying to figure out how we can set a science-based ambition level for each issue area is the bread and butter of what we're thinking through right now. Be it based on something like the SDGs, or based on planetary boundaries, based on kind of system dynamic models at local or regional scale. There's a lot of different options that we're considering, and we're going to be seeking feedback from you. Crucially, this is kind of between step 3 and step 5, the kind of tracking. Also, one of the other things we're really starting to think through now, sorry, can you just go back really quick, is how and where should a company disclose their target and on a given issue? Who is SBTN going to be validating these targets? Are third parties going to be playing a key role? We're thinking through all of that right now. And I know that many of you have had an experience with SBTI doing this validation. So at a high level, on the next slide, wanted to just quickly give you a preview of where we're going in the next few months and couple of years. I know that a lot of you have sort of asked, yeah, we get that you're trying to get to validatable targets in 2022, but when is it going to be available? Like, when can we actually start setting science-based targets for water and land and so on? So starting with the initial guidance that came out in September, what we're doing over the next few months is developing kind of specific proposals on those key questions that I just went over on steps 1 through 3. And those are the ones that we really need to answer before we can start validating any targets. We have to have pretty rigorous answers to all of those questions. And we're going to be seeking feedback from you over the next few months. I'll show you a table in just a second that talks about when we're going to be doing each thing. But all of those key questions on steps 1 through 3, we're going to be developing proposals over the next few months and then seeking feedback on them. That will culminate in what we're starting to call the kind of 101 method document. You can think of this as sort of a more detailed version of the initial guidance that's going to give a richer discussion on those kind of key questions and criteria. That's going to be coming sometime around the same time that the initial guidance was in 2020. So think, September-ish 2021. Obviously, we'll be getting feedback from all of you in the process going up to that as well. And that kind of, you can think of that as sort of a menu. Some of these are going to have standardized answers to those questions, and some of them are going to be kind of issue specific. Like I was noting before, that some of the prioritization criteria might be different for water than they would be for biodiversity. So that 101 document is going to provide, in some cases, universal answers. This is how SBTN does something. And in other cases, it will provide a menu of different ways that we can do it, like different types of prioritization criteria. And then issue-specific methods are going to come after that. So the water, for instance, the SBT water methodology and the SBT land methodology are going to be developed both in tandem with that 101 document, but also build on it because we're trying to kind of work at the issue level and in a cross-cutting fashion to make sure that each issue is treated roughly similarly. We think that the water methodology and the land methodology are going to be the first two that are kind of ready to pilot fully. The water one, I think some of the companies on the line are already kind of talking to our water hub and thinking about taking part in those pilots, which will be starting over the next couple months. But all of these methods will basically go to piloting stage when they're ready to be piloted. And some of them may be before the 101 documents complete. Others of them might be after the 101 documents complete. But they will, we want to just make this clear that the piloting is going to be a rolling process. We're not going to kind of wait until all of the methods are ready to go. When a method or an issue is ready to be piloted, we're gonna bring it to you all, and the companies, consultants that are ready to work on it will be able to start working on it. If we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the specific schedule about kind of when we're going to discuss different things. So the next meeting of this group will be in early February of 2021, and that's going to be building on the work that we just started with Katie and Alex. We're going to be doing a workshop on user needs associated with tools, getting your feedback on, all of the great information we already got from you. We used IBAT, we used GBS, we used, water risk filter. Like, get your feedback on what was the experience like? What, did this allow you to fully complete step one? Like, what more would you need to do that? Really get a good understanding of what are your needs and how are the tools today helping you meet those or not. We're hoping to do kind of one-on-one interviews with companies that are interested and willing to do so within the February to March timeframe to kind of build on that workshop that we'll be doing in February. And then in March, we'll come back together and have a kind of workshop on some of the answers to some of those key questions that I was talking about, generally on steps 1 and 2. So this will be, the first 2 of the meetings are going to be specific to tools and our toolkit work stream. The third meeting will be a more general meeting about steps 1 and 2. And crucially, you'll see on the slides, which will be distributed, who do we need from your company? It might be the kind of general contact. It might be a very specific, like a specific person, like the technical tool users are going to be the people we want to talk to about the tools, obviously. On the next slide, then, moving forward in time in April, we're going to switch back then again to the tools work stream and kind of review the draft user needs specification that WCMC is going to be coming up with through the February and March timeframe, and then we'll have as well. Excuse me, I misspoke there. The review is going to be a desk review. So after you've been doing the interview, you're going to be sent the user needs specification, and you will have time to review it. In April, we'll have kind of focus groups to gather further input on that user needs specification. Make sure that we have all of the right kind of information and detail and nuance about user needs brought together in that document. We'll then have we think we're then going to have a slight break just based on the workflow internally. And in June, we'll be coming back together for a feedback session on step 3, which June is when we expect to have some kind of relatively advanced answers on the really detailed technical questions present in step 3, like allocation methods and various other parts of the kind of measurement framework. So that'll be an important meeting that we hope most of you can take part in. Next slide. So this slide just gives the general overview of what I just talked through. The next couple months, February and March, will be focused on the toolkit work stream. End of March, the general feedback on steps 1 and 2 when subject to the proposals being developed. April, again, the user needs process will be kind of moving forward and further work there. And then in June, we'll see this overall step 3 process culminate and have some of detailed discussions about the measurement and monitoring framework. So I see there's been questions being answered throughout the time. If you go to the next slide, I think I'm passing now. Yeah. Anybody from the SBTN team want to highlight any of the key questions on the line before we move to comms?
Chris, we were asked how we're going to communicate progress from the Water Hub pilots, and we plan on letting you guys know the results of their work when they're complete.
Okay. Anything else, or should we move to communications?
Move.
Okay. Turning it over now to Tara Burke, our SBTN comms lead, to talk about some communications elements of the program.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. Great to have you all on this call. I've just got a few, not much to say, not much to add, but just going from the technical to kind of how we, this program can really help us kind of amplify the work that we're doing. If we go to the next slide, you know, the power of the network really lies in its collective voice. And so as corporate engagement members, we're kind of counting on you to promote SBTN within your organizations, to your value chains and to your peer companies, and for industry coalitions to your members and consultancies to your clients. So this means for things when you're attending events or where you can add information on websites, newsletters. If you're speaking to the media, is there an opportunity there to talk about the work that you're doing and the efforts that you're making aligned with SBTN, and also social media? So we've created a pack of information which is linked at the end of this set of slides, which gives you some details. So ideally you'd share that with your comms leads, and also have a look at it yourselves, because in there it talks about how you can get talking points for events and media and so on, the sort of copy that you can use for websites and social media. So the more that you can share this kind of content, the better. As a starting point, there's a social media card in there to say that your organization has joined this corporate engagement program. So just sharing that on social media is a great way of publicizing the work of the network. The other thing that's extremely valuable for us to get from you is some feedback on our messaging and the kind of content that would be useful to you to sort of get your internal buy-in within your own organizations, or to tell others about what SBTN is. So there's, for you in the communications document, there is a link to a survey. So if you're able to fill that in, we're asking questions like what kind of messages would resonate most with your company, with your leadership, with your peers, with your value chains, and also what sort of formats of content do you feel like you would really need? Is it decks? Is it printed materials? Is it videos? So it literally shouldn't take you more than a few minutes to complete, but it would be super helpful for us. If you go on to the next slide, really interesting to, kind of, and exciting to hear where you guys are already kind of on this journey. And what we're really looking for from a comms perspective is some insights into your experiences. These are really helpful to inspire other companies to do what you're doing. And we can, the more stories that we get from you, the more that we can share them through the media, through our own channels, and through our own sort of events and things like that we're attending. The stories that land particularly well in this kind of work is talking about the challenges that you're facing and overcoming, the innovations that you're coming up with, the benefits to your business of doing this work, interesting stories about the local communities that you might be working with, or any areas of nature that have a particular special interest. Also inspirational people within your organization, so they might have a story to tell about why they decided to change their business model to protect and restore nature, or maybe they're innovators, those kinds of things. So just how we can kind of tell those human stories about, this really critical work. As part of the Global Commons Alliance, which I know was mentioned earlier, we've also created some media partnerships, and there'll be more of those to come. So Munga Bay is one of them, Now This Earth is another. So those are platforms which do take a look at, but they're also looking for stories on what companies are doing. So my contacts are all going to be shared, so please get in touch with any stories that you might have, or if you just want to know more about the process of sharing stories. There's also some information in the document that I've shared. On the next slide, it's just about the actions that can easily be taken. So just following our social media channels and engaging with our content. If you've got content about some of the actions that you're taking in relation to your work with the SBTN, then we'd love to share that as well. So please let us know. Also on websites, newsletters, through the media, and so on. So yeah, please just, if you can make sure that you take that resource, have a look at it yourselves, also share it with your comms leads, introduce me to your comms leads as well. Then I've got a direct line, as I know that, you know, we always need to go through comms channels. That would be fantastic. Please also add any questions in the chat if you've got any thing you need to clarify about what I've shared. Okay, and now I think we're going back to you, Jess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Next slide. So thanks everyone. We really wanted you to understand where we're at in the process technically. And we also want you to know that we're very committed to co-creating these tools and methods with you. We want at the end of this process to have something that's really user-friendly, cost-effective, fits in with what you're already doing, doesn't create extra work. So that's why we put this group together. And now you see all the questions we're grappling with, and we really hope that you'll engage to the extent that you can. We have designed this program so that it is modular and flexible, so you can get engaged with as much or as little as you'd like. There's going to be a ton of opportunities on different aspects of what we're doing. So don't feel obligated to have to come to everything, but if you want to come to everything or send other folks from your team to our stuff, to our meetings, we would welcome them very much. Also, if you have a key customer or key supplier that you think would find value in working with us right now, and you really want to get the value chain discussion going, please do encourage them to join the program, because the sooner we get started communicating together on where we're going, the better we're going to be in 2 years. I did get a question during the session about our capacity to help you one-on-one. We have, as you can see, we have a really small team. So unfortunately, we don't have capacity at this moment or funding to help you individually. So our plan is to support you as a group. And that means providing you resources as we go, as identified as needed. And also having learning sessions where if you raise issues across the board and everyone's struggling with the same questions, we can have live discussions on those topics and give you live feedback to the extent that we're able to answer questions. With respect to resources, some of the things that we have planned are structured feedback surveys for step 1, and we will be sending them out quite shortly. So I know some of you have already done step 1 and done a lot on step 1. So for you guys, we just want you to benchmark against the guidance and give us feedback on how it's working or not working from your perspective. And then I also saw in the survey, a lot of you have not started yet. So we would love for you to go through the guidance, and we'll have a structured way of doing that so that your feedback will help inform if this guidance is working for a company that's just starting or not, and how we can improve that. And so we'll be sending out surveys shortly to do that, and you have a year to fill them out. We also, if you haven't already provided feedback on the guidance, please do within a month, and there's a survey link for you to do that. And then, as Tara mentioned, we have a lot of social media collateral and corporate engagement communications collateral, so you can get that at this link here. And we are quite interested in hearing back from you and your communications team on what you need to sell in what we're doing to your leadership and to your customers and to your value chain. Like, what do you need from us, and what format do you need from us in order to communicate what we're doing and make this work for everybody? So please do fill out the survey that Tara mentioned, because that'll help us create some tools for you to go on out and promote what we're doing. And we also have a member-only website portal, and this is going to be where we put important documents like FAQs. So we're going to take all the questions you guys asked today and come up with some answers so that you can keep referring to that. We'll put webinars on there, recordings of the webinars, and we'll put the opportunities for engagement there on that members only website. And then we're also, and this is really important, we're going to have a section for member announcements. So I did see flagged during this discussion the desire to exchange information amongst the companies as we go. Right now, we don't have the ability to do that in an interactive way, and we'll look into that. But what we can do is get emails from you on announcements, best practices and barriers you're experiencing, questions you're having, and we can post that to the page and be quite transparent about what everyone's doing. And so that's the way we can share information right now. And there's an email right there where you can that you can send your information to. And I'll give you one example of a best practice that was shared with me by one of the members, and that was BL Evolution. And they have put together a learning group of French companies where they'll speak in French to the companies, and the group will share experiences and struggles and help each other out in doing all the steps as they roll out for a Science-Based Target Network, starting with step 1. And we're going to post that onto this members portal with the contact information if you want to get involved. So if you have something like that going on and you want to share it with the community, or if you get sparked by that idea and you want to do it on your own, please do. And that's the intention of this special space that we have. Next slide. We did want to get some calendar dates for you right now for engagement and learning opportunities. So some of these times might change depending on what we do in each session. And we might even have to add some dates, but we're going to mix in engagement opportunities where we're going to get feedback on you on the various questions that the tools team and Chris raised today. And we will also take the questions that are coming up for you, and where there's a quorum and there's a challenge that you all are struggling with, we will have learning sessions to discuss that live. So that is the intention of these dates. And if you have ideas for what we can do in some of these sessions, a topic, please just let me know. I really want to make sure that we're serving you as we go. And on that note, I would love to hear from folks who I haven't talked to individually yet. Send me an email so we can set up a call so I can hear from you where you're at in the process, what you'd like to get out of the program, how we can make this better for you. We really want this to be an enjoyable experience, and we want it to be a place where we can all learn from each other. That's our intention. So just send me a note. And then the final slide is the key contacts. So again, if you have general or administrative questions like, I can't figure out how to pay my fee, please send that to that email address, okay? Like anything general, any of the questions that you're having, technical in nature, you can send that to this for us to address or post. If you have other questions and requests, even if it's for the technical team, please send them to me first, and then I'll sort it out. We don't want to overload the technical team right now because they have a lot to do, as you can see. So I promise to take care of your requests, but please do send that to me first. And then finally, again, we are very serious about the comms angle, and I know a lot of you want to promote what you're doing and the great work you're doing. So Tara is the right person to get in contact with if you want to know, how can I promote this? Where can I promote this? When can I promote this? That's up to Tara. So that concludes our presentation. Are there any questions that came up that we should answer live, team? No? Okay, so the next steps are we're going to send out an email to all of you and some of the folks that could not join us today with this webinar recording, which will have all the links. And then you'll be hearing from us shortly on the surveys that we mentioned. And in the meantime, please do get in contact with me if we haven't already talked, to just introduce ourselves to each other and hear where you're at. And stay tuned for our tools workshop, which should be really fun and very useful, I think, for all of us. Sorry, we got a question, Sam?
Yeah, Jess, we just have one question left in the Q&A. It's as a consultancy firm, can we work with a company engaged in the corporate engagement program, or should it be a company not engaged?
We're not controlling anyone. You can do whatever you want, whatever makes sense. And I did get a question earlier from a consultancy that asked if they can work with companies not part of the program on this stuff. Yes, please do. We want to scale this. We want companies wherever they are in their journey to get started now. So yes, that's perfectly fine.
Great. Thank you, Jess.
Yeah. Well, thanks to all, and get a few minutes back in your day. And again, let me know how we can make this really good for you, because we got 2 years to work together and we want this to be an awesome experience. Thanks, everyone.